The Aspler family story of arrival in Canada began in 1899 when the Hamburg-American liner MS Patricia docked in New York carrying a young immigrant, Joina Aspler. Joina's plans were not to stay in New York but rather settle in Montreal, where he already had an aunt, his mother's youngest sister, and her husband. However, traveling in late fall was chancy with the possibility of ice blocking the St. Lawrence, so New York was seen as the station stop along the way. Like millions of others, Joina's first taste of the New World was a processing center at Ellis Island. On the ship's manifest, he's identified as being an Austrian, 27 years of age, from Suceava, now part of Romania. At this time, he was a married man and had left his wife Chaya and infant son Philip with plans to have them join them once he had settled in. This was a common practice in those days for the husband to get things sorted out and then send the passage for the rest of the family. The family moved into a house at 1042 to 1044 St. Dominic Street, and it was here on August 22, 1910, that Moe was born. In addition to his older brother Philip, another brother, preceded him in 1905 when Moe was 5. Charlie, the youngest brother, was born 5 years later. The area where the family lived, just east of Mount Royal, was the destination of choice for many of the Jewish immigrants. There were Jewish social clubs, restaurants, synagogues, and shops. It was a lively multicultural area, and you were more likely to hear Yiddish as any other language. In 1915 or 16, Joina discovered that Philip had joined the Canadian Army to fight overseas. He had to negotiate with the authorities to have him released from duty. Philip was the quintessential older brother, the adventurer of the family. Here are a number of photos showing the brothers, Moe and Charles, and then Philip, Moe, and Charles. Moe attended Mount Royal School, graduating in 1923. That's him in the photo. He's at the extreme right, third from the bottom, with one of the other students' hands on his shoulder. Moe's high school years were at Barrenbing, graduating in 1928. The story goes that he wasn't very diligent, and according to Charlie, had to repeat a year. I vaguely remember my father telling me that he spent a fair bit of his leisure time at the various pool halls on St. Lawrence Boulevard. Despite this, his graduation photo shows him as class president, so I imagine he managed to recover some lost ground from his less than perfect time as a student. In 1924, Philip had secretly eloped with Florence Hutchins, a non-Jew, and twin sons were born. However, shortly afterwards he came down with cancer, and in 1928 he passed away. The marriage and the birth of his sons came as a complete shock to his parents, and while they offered to take in the two boys, Florence had decided that she could manage. She did take care of the boys, but they were never far from our family. Joina had a special place in the family, and he was regarded as the spirit and conscience of the community. While his official occupation was a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, and Baal Tefillah, a reader of prayers, for the synagogue, he was in fact a one-person fundraiser for poor immigrant families. He assessed what people could afford, and no one denied him. Everyone supported his charitable work, and he helped in every way that they could. Both Joina and Chaya opened their doors to new immigrants, and Moe and Charlie recalled how on many occasions they had to sleep on the floor so that their bedrooms could be made available to others. When Joina died in 1957, almost 1,000 people attended his funeral. In fact, the notebooks that he kept for his whole life, indicating all the charitable donations, were actually buried with him. Meanwhile, it's back to the 30s and the Depression was still on and money was tight. Fortunately, Izzy was making a decent living as a part-time band leader. He was actually very well known, and even as a student had spent his summers playing for the famous Benson Orchestra in Chicago. And it was Izzy who helped keep the family afloat during these lean years. After Barrenbing, my father went to McGill and then University of Montreal, where he graduated in law. And while he was at university, he supported himself during the summer months by playing piano on the various cruise ships going up and down the St. Lawrence. It was still the 1930s, and life wasn't as very hospitable for young Jewish lawyers. My father told me that the only case he had as a lawyer was when he was called in to help repossess furniture. The story goes that an elderly man showed up with his son, or grandson, to try to bargain to not have his furniture repossessed. At the time, the law stated that until the last nickel was paid off, the furniture belonged to the seller. At one point in the meeting, the old man started to cry, and Moe, witnessing this, tore up the repossession paperwork and told the man to go home. He never actively practiced law again. What he did do, however, was sell brushes door to door, play the piano, and later in the 1930s joined in with Izzy to sell life insurance. Throughout the 30s, my father always kept active. He was on the McGill basketball team. He played water polo for the local YMHA, where he also contributed his tap dancing skills at various Y performances. Here's a photo of him strutting his stuff at the minstrel show in 1936. In reviewing the show, a writer with the Montreal Gazette noted that, quote, Moe Aspler, specialty tap dancer, was particularly good in his act. In 1938, Charles, who was studying architecture, won a scholarship to travel through Europe. While there in November 1938, his mother, who had suffered from diabetes, had passed away at the age of 64. Charles returned in 1939 just as Europe was entering a very dark phase in history, and a year later, Joina remarried Sarah Reisler. Moe continued to work with Iz to sell life insurance and managed to take the odd trip to the Laurentians, the United States, and spend a lot of time with friends and relatives. When the war broke out, Moe joined the RCAF and Charles joined the Army. Moe went back to school learning radar technology for the Air Force. Here's a couple of shots of Moe at McGill where the program was being held. On August 22, 1942, on his birthday, Moe left for Europe on the Awatia on convoy AT-10. The Awatia was carrying the first and largest contingent of Canadian air crew to Britain. There were about 5,000 on board. However, en route there was a terrible accident. The thick fog caused a number of collisions, and at one point a U.S. destroyer, the USS Buck, collided with the Awatia, causing serious damage. When another U.S. destroyer, the Ingraham, came to investigate, she collided with a third ship with catastrophic results. The Ingraham exploded, and of the crew of 250, only 11 survived. Meanwhile, the Awatia was in grave danger of sinking and had left the convoy to return unescorted to Halifax. The first stage of this trip was very dangerous, since as a damaged and unescorted ship, she would be a sitting duck for German U-boats. However, everyone was relieved when the escorts finally arrived and brought the ship safely back into port. Moe eventually made it overseas and joined the Bomber Command Squadron in Yorkshire, England. For the balance of the war, as part of the ground crew, he was instrumental in servicing the Lancaster bombers on their night bombing raids over Germany. Here are a few photos of the period, including Moe on leave. While on leave, he connected with Charlie and other fellow Montrealers who were also serving overseas. As the war was drawing to a close, Moe expressed an interest in staying on in Europe to help the anticipated flood of homeless and displaced refugees. Iz, who had connections in Ottawa, lobbied on Moe's behalf, and once he was released from his official RCAF duties, he was assigned to work at Landsberg, a large displaced persons camp not far from Munich. It was here at Landsberg that Moe met Mina Friedland, a Jewish-Polish refugee and the sole survivor of her family. Mina had managed to get a job in the camp office where Moe worked as the camp deputy director. They fell in love, and on April 11, 1946, were married. Mina wore a wedding dress made from curtain material, and once the wedding was over, she gave the dress so that other prospective camp brides could wear it. Bridal shops were not particularly numerous for refugees in post-war Germany. Following the wedding, the couple went on to a honeymoon through Germany, France, Switzerland, and England. And Moe was finally released from his UNRWA commitment on September 26, 1946. And then they traveled to New York from Southampton on the Aquitania in the fall of '46. After visiting Mina's relatives in Connecticut, New Jersey, and Baltimore, the couple arrived at Montreal, first staying with Moe's parents and then moving into their own apartment on Chomedy Street. Upon his return, Moe became quite involved in community affairs, and because of his experience in UNRWA, became a regular speaker at Jewish community events. Mina as well, despite her limited English, also gave talks about her experiences and life as a DP. On January the 8th, 1948, Fania and I arrived on the scene, and we all settled into the cramped space on Chomedy Street. By this time, my father was in the insurance business full-time, partnering up with his brother Iz, and while business was very slow to start, it eventually improved to the point that they were able to move into a commercial office address. When it came to the needy, there were no limits to the extent that my father helped. He became familiar with the plight of an aging Holocaust survivor and his wife. The man had been a shoemaker in his former life, and he was in Montreal destitute as he tried to set himself up as a shoemaker. However, it was winter, and no one was spending any money on shoe repair, but Moe went to everyone he knew asking them for shoes to repair so that he could deliver them to Isaac. Because of this act of helping, the couple managed to make it through the winter. And this was just one of many acts of my parents' gestures of kindness and charity. Nor were we neglected as a family. Almost every summer we spent weekends and sometimes a whole summer at various rental cottages in the Laurentians and near Plattsburgh, New York. Often my father would rent a cottage for the summer or part of the summer. He would work during the week and then join us on weekends. There were also numerous trips to New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, where a lot of my mother's and father's relatives were living. I think by the time Fanny and I were 13 years old, we had been to New York something like 10 times. And there were also the various Canada Life conventions across the United States and Canada, to which my father almost always took our mother. Throughout the 60s and through the 70s, Moe continued his community work, working with the Hebrew Free Loan Association, and later in the 60s, when many Jews were arriving from Morocco, he became very involved in the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society. Mina, for her part, joined Ort and Hadassah, and so between the two of them, they both spent a huge amount of time at meetings and various fundraisers. There were many times when I recall my parents dressed up to attend the various charity events and balls. They seemed to have a dizzying social schedule, always around good causes. And like his own parents, my father and Mina offered to share their apartment with others. I remember a young family from England, a couple from South Africa, and later on other guests from Europe and Israel. When relatives and friends fell on hard times, he hired them to work in the insurance office. He never turned down a request for help. When my father wasn't working in the office or on his various community projects, he was reading. Moe was a voracious reader, consuming books and newspapers, mainly in French, and often in the topics of Judaica. I remember him sitting in his favorite chair with a stack of heavy dictionaries and notepads where he could record various definitions and translations. His proficiency in French was such that he became certified as an official French-English translator. This interest in books led him to become very involved in Montreal's Jewish Public Library, and through his association on the board was quite active in hosting various events and meeting a number of luminaries, including Elie Wiesel and others. The other important memory I have is of the many dinners and parties hosted by my parents. Their circle of friends, the Bernsteins, the Malins, the Tretmans, the Jolsons, Uncle Charles and Aunt Estelle, the Spears and the Tomans, among many others, were often of the highest intellectual caliber. My father often held court at these affairs, and I was always in awe with the depth and range of discussion, from politics, Israel, national affairs, and culture. In one evening, the conversation could easily start out with national energy policy, shift to the Middle East, and end up with discussions around art and local politics. We eventually moved from Chomedy Street to a larger apartment in Saint Laurent, and then in 1953 to a duplex apartment on Dornell Avenue in Snowdon, and finally, in 1961, to a house on Bailey Road in Côte St. Luc. My father was always a trailblazer. We were the first in our neighborhood to have a TV, a dishwasher, electric home heating, and a burglar alarm. He was, after all, an insurance broker. We were the pioneers. My father was also a great booster for my mother. He encouraged her to travel, be independent, and do things that interested her. If she saw a coat she liked, he would tell her to buy it. If she was interested in making some extra money outside the home, he would say, go for it. He never stood in her way. He knew how lucky he was to have her. He supported her many trips to Israel, 35 in total, and in 1981 he encouraged her to attend a reunion of Holocaust survivors in Israel. He was a key influence in having her tell her story of survival and was incredibly proud of her life, always looking forward and sharing her wisdom and experience. He was also very supportive as a father. Although he had a difficult temper, which sometimes caused me to tiptoe around him, he was always there on the big issues. In every respect, he would do anything and everything for Mina, my sister and I, and for the grandkids he was so proud to have. In October 1981, my father suddenly passed away. He lived his life as an example, generous, kind, and everybody's official cheerleader, no matter what the circumstance. He was a true mensch.